Good evening and welcome to Zion's Banner. I'm hoping everything works okay. My software decided to reinstall right before I went on. So it is amazing the way that works, but I am excited to be with you and to start having people populate the room. So, um, we are continuing our adventures in Matthew. I think sometime in the future, because of interactions I've had with a certain gentleman, it might be wise to do a thing on, well, we'll see. He kept saying that the church was grafted into Israel, and I see some problems with that, so I'll parse that and we'll worry about it in the near future. But do know that I learn a lot through other people's objections. And so this gentleman's theories are kind of interesting and yet extremely disturbing. Um, Tonight is our more Bible study and not so much apologetics night, but that doesn't mean that we won't be making some applications. Now, I look for key features in the text, and so we may hit a few rabbit trails, but I think the rabbit trails that come out of the text. So I'm going to switch us over here. By the way, just a word for those I did get to see at Doctrine on the Block. That was really fun, especially folks who don't live in the valley. So I really enjoyed that. And so I'm getting ready for the big M to M conference, which I might put a plug in at the end for. We're going to get started on our PowerPoint tonight, where we'll be continuing our adventures in Matthew. So I'm just shifting a little bit here. If you're wondering where we're at, we had started the first miracle, and we had actually gotten into um, we'd actually gotten into the first two. So we're going to continue with Peter's mother-in-law. And you're going to find Peter's mother-in-law is a short pericope in Matthew 18:14. It's really only two sentences. Um, Someone's responding to that. Yes, John made a comment on that topic, and I'm thinking of dealing with it and recommending a resource to you. So we'll deal with a little next week, but I may take this gentleman's views as a real challenge to a proper understanding of the doctrine of the church and the doctrine of grace. He seems like a one law movement kind of guy, but he's got some really weird ideas. I know where he gets them from, but I think he's missing the point of what Paul is saying. And so I'm really thinking that it may be wise to deal with these, and it would be good for me. This falls within the area of my dissertation. So that's really neat. Hey, by the way, even though this is going on YouTube, a happy Valentine's Day to you all. No, I'm not being a pagan. There really was a bishop who did some charitable acts. And while I don't believe in saints in the same way as the Catholic Church, a day celebrating love, which is an attribute of God, does not bother me so much. And thinking about one's spouse and one's family is certainly a worthwhile exercise. So, a happy Valentine's Day to you all, and I can extend that to the community because you are all really neat, and I really appreciate all of you. Um, so, let's go into how Jesus continues to display his authority. And we're going to talk about the role some of that plays. Um, Now, I've been playing around with color, so I hope this works well for you. I have to let you know that rust used to be my favorite color, burgundy, but I guess, drawn to the purples too. So welcome to the attempt to use a slightly different color palette. And you can leave comments. I have a lot of friends tell me that my taste in colors and ties is not necessarily the greatest, but I just wanted to do a little something different. Let's look at this next miracle here, 8:14 through 17. Okay. And we're going to deal with this section here. Now, when Jesus had come into Peter's house, he saw his wife's mother laying sick with a fever, and he touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she arose and served them. When evening had come, they brought to him many who were demon possessed, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all those, that might be fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He himself took up our infirmities and bore our diseases. And so we're going to deal with these two miracles, what they mean and what they don't mean. And we want to end up being somewhat careful with this whole thing. We're going to see people have sometimes taken it too far. And we're going to try to kind of keep it all in context and still end up really getting into this. So we start with the text. This is all being treated as one pericope. Now, we talked about that. That's basically a section of scripture that has the same idea behind it. And so now let's start digging in. You start with the text and you work from there. Now, notice whose house Jesus goes back to. He goes back to Peter's house. Now, when I was in Israel, I actually had the opportunity to visit Peter's house, which was really kind of nice and neat. They did build a Catholic shrine over it, because one of the things we said in Israel is if they can build a Catholic shrine over anything, they will. And as our tour guide kind of said, he wished they didn't. And in some ways, I really, I kind of agree with that. I kind of want to see what it looked like at the time, as opposed to not seeing what it looks like at the time. And so I kind of wish that I would have had more of the architecture and could have just stuck there. But let's talk a little bit more about Peter. Peter's one of the inner three. You're going to see three disciples. Not because Peter was perfect. We're going to see he's far from perfect. But he's kind of the inner core. And so within the 12, you have the three. And then you have a slightly larger number, which tells me that Jesus had no problem more intensely discipling some rather than discipling all. In other words, Jesus didn't feel that he had to give all the time and all the discipling equally among his disciples. And I think there are reasons that he as a leader decided to do that under the direction of the Father. Peter's going to be key in the early church. James is going to be key in the early church. And so Peter has a role to play. Let's learn a little bit more about Peter. 1 Corinthians 9:5 says that Peter, along with other married apostles, took his wife with him on missionary journeys. Later traditions discuss his children. Clement of Alexandria, in his work, states that Peter was present at the martyrdom of his wife. You can also see a reference in Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History. There's more about Peter, but what I want you to notice is the man had a mother-in-law. Now, having come off of Doctrine on the Block, one of the things that struck me is that you'd have to be really foolish to have a mother-in-law and not be married. And so I thought, well, is this whole marriage thing and forced celibacy been a problem in church history? Where did it come from? And how did it affect Jewish views of the gospel? And so we're going to take a little bit of a side trip here, because it really does sort of affect Jewish views of the gospel. Peter was not celibate. So I don't understand the thinking behind the forced celibacy. We're going to talk about the place of singleness, just brief, I'm not giving biblical counseling here. I'm giving just kind of an overview. But one of the things that struck me was that really this idea of forced celibacy for spiritual office is kind of a strange thing to me. Rabbis were usually married. And so, how did this come about and where did this come about? And by the way, I consider it a bad idea. Now, why do you say that? I'm not saying singleness is a bad idea. We'll talk about that. I consider this a bad idea because I think it's led to many of the problems the Catholic Church is facing right now. Um, I think the idea of forcing individuals who may not be totally prepared for a life of clerical celibacy has created problems. And by the way, this has become a big issue because recently the Pope had the opportunity to rule that certain priests in South America could indeed be married because there's a shortage of priests in South America. And so this became a real hot potato. The conservative wing, I'll say the more formal uh, wing of the Catholic Church does not want any relaxation of the forced celibacy because they might have to view it in terms of that setting a precedent, while the more, what was called on the news broadcast, the more progressive wing of the Catholic Church did want him to rule that this was a possibility. The result was he did not rule that the South American priests could be married. So he elected not to do that. And so I just found that interesting. Um, Interesting verse that is coming up. Well, we can take a look at it. The Gospels record Jesus saying there are eunuchs who are born that way, others who are made that way by men. Now, I did mark this as non-kid friendly because I just said something here you don't talk about with little Johnny who's, say, 5 because they're going to ask more questions. And then there are others who live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom. Who can accept this should accept it. Um, Here's the answer to that. Always check the background. Jesus is talking about divorce and marriage. And so the disciples say, well, man, if marriage is permanent and there's no allowance for divorce, which, by the way, Judaism did allow for, and the Pharisees did allow for, it's still allowed for today. If you get a certificate of divorcement, which is mentioned in terms of Moses, it's called a get in the Jewish community. Then you have that divorcement that is allowable in the Hasidic community. If a Jewish person becomes a believer, you can almost guarantee that he's going to end up with a divorce on his hands. And in the Hasidic community, he may never see his children again. So there is a real cost. In the Reformed community, I don't think they care whether someone believes in God, so they're not overly worried about Jesus so much as far as divorcement. Um, but this occurs in the area of divorcement. And Jesus is responding to the disciples' comment that, wow, if marriage is for keeps, you might get burned. And so his response is in terms of the issue of multiple remarriages. And what he's basically saying is that if a partner is separated from you, uh, there is good reason to try and remain true to that covenant, even if the other partner isn't there. Now that's stuff. I mean, I taught on this at a what they called a Singles Again group, which was a group for divorced persons. And I said, look, I'm not trying to make life difficult for you. But I did teach on this. John Williams is going to a verse we're going to go to in Corinthians. So if John can hang out just a little bit, we'll end up talking about that. Let's talk about the Catholic side first, okay? Simply because, well, it doesn't come up in Judaism quite as much. Rabbis can be married, so this isn't a big thing. Now, I'm getting my screen set a little bit Might change my positioning a little bit. By the way, guys, you can get the PowerPoints, but if you're really having trouble seeing the screen, let me know. I can go to a full screen. You'll hear my voice, but you won't see me. Okay, but I can honestly do that. I can actually go to a full screen here and give you the PowerPoint. Well, I could, but I can do that. I can actually pull myself out if you need me to. So just let me know in the chat. Someone pointed out to me that it is difficult. The screen should come back in a minute. Some pointed out to me it's difficult to see the screen sometimes. In screen over screen in the software, you have only so much room to play with. And I'm not seeing it the way you are. So you need to understand something. I have my browser smaller so I can see more than one window. So I don't know exactly what you're seeing. But let's talk about this. The earliest textual evidence for the forbidding of marriage to clerics and the duty of those married to abstain from. Now, this is interesting. This is not for kids. Sexual contact with their wives was in the 4th century decrees of the Synod of Elvira and the later Council of Carthage. According to some writers, presumed a previous norm which was flaunted in practice. Now, let me parse that for you. Okay, we have councils and synods going on. Now, 390 would put it after the 2 Nicene councils, interestingly enough. The 4th century decree of the Synod of Elvira is also mentioned. Now, that's important because it tells me that that was not necessarily the rule at a time. In other words, there was a time, you're talking 300 years here. So that was not always the rule. That's what I'm getting at. You know, if you're looking at the early church, you don't start in the 300s. That's just kind of just a general observation here. That you wouldn't start in the 300s. You'd start just a little sooner than that. The Synod of Elvira, that's 305. So that's a little bit before the Council of Nicaea. Canon 33, it was decided that marriage is altogether prohibited for bishops, priests, and deacons, or in all clerics placed in the ministry, and that they keep away from their wives and not beget children. Whosoever does this shall be deprived of the honor of clerical office. So you're right before Nicaea and then right after Nicaea. By the way, what's really interesting about this is that you can have individuals who are married and then they have to live celibate for the rest of their lives. And I will let you know that that doesn't seem real practical for reasons that are not necessarily rated PG, but you just have to be aware of. And so that's kind of what we're dealing with there. What I'm pointing out is essentially that that was not always the case. Now you have to understand how that was distinctly different in Judaism. Here's Dr. Michael Brown, and here's an objection leveled at the gospel. Judaism's a healthy religion. Jews don't see the world as intrinsically evil or denounce marriage or call for self-renunciation. Christians, on the other hand, see the world as evil, advocate celibacy, and say, deny yourself, take up your cross, and suffer. Now, that's not a legitimate objection, but I want to show you there was some kickback that started to occur in Judaism related to this whole issue. Now let's talk about the Corinthians passage, where Paul says that he wishes all men were like him. Dr. Brown points out something, but this is what Jesus and Paul intended, right? Are you aware that the other apostles were married and that Paul's celibacy was an exception? 1 Corinthians 9:5. Are you aware that Paul expected leaders of the church to be married with children? See 1 Timothy 3:1 through 5 and Titus 1:6. He even asked the question in 1 Timothy 1 And in 3:5, if anyone does not know how to manage his own household, how can he take care of the church of God? Now, the point that he's making here is celibacy is not regarded as the norm for those who are in full-time service or in ministry. Not even by Paul. Okay? Judaism did not require rabbis, leaders, to be unmarried. In fact, the patriarchs all married, and they're considered fairly high. King David overmarried, not the norm, but that was certainly permissible. You have prophets who were married, not all of them, but some of them were. Judaism never regarded marriage as any less spiritual or celibacy as a requirement. Now, he's not, the person who's making this objection, it's not being totally fair. Okay? And I can go into that, but let's just go into Paul. What about Paul's famous passage in 1 Corinthians 7, 6 through 9? Let's read it together. But I say this as a concession, not as a command, for I wish all men were even as myself, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good that you remain even as I. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Now, that's the famous passage. Okay, that's the famous passage around this. Let's put this in some context, though. Paul's writing real letters to real people going through real situations, and you'll notice his epistles don't raise the same issues the same way anyway. Okay? So I'm going to say we need to look, whenever you're looking at an epistle, try to find out the background and the situations that Paul's addressing or the writer's addressing. Okay, so these are letters to house churches in a given city and in a given cultural situation. So what do we know about the situation in Corinth when Paul's writing this? Well, there was a problem with social unrest or persecution. So these directives are connected to the fact that there is an imminent threat to the house churches in that area. Now, how do I know this? Well, there's historic background. Folks, we've actually got some historic writers about the time period. And so we have some back history here, which God has preserved. Paul refers to the present crisis in Corinthians 7:26 because of the present situation or crisis, which gave Christians rethinking in the appropriateness of engaged couples getting married. That's 725, where it talks to a father. If your daughter is a virgin and the idea is she's engaged to be married, then you have an issue because the father really in Roman law held incredible power over the household. In fact, really life and death power. And so the father could then have forbidded the marriage. I am very fond of any young man who asks the father for his blessing to marry a daughter of that father. In other words, if a young man comes and asks those who are either acting as the authority or the father himself, if he's alive, for the blessing of marrying that spouse, I'm really impressed by that. It respects the father's role, and I really appreciate that. And so there was a opportunity for these Corinthian fathers to then say, no, given the present situation, given the Lord's work and the way it's being threatened, I do not think this is a good time for that engagement to be followed through with marriage. Now, what produced this? Well, there's some archaeological and literary evidence that indicates there may have been food shortages in Corinth during this period, which, now understand this, this could lead to riots. This could also lead to blaming the Christians. And believe me, there was no shortage of people that were willing to do that, to say essentially you've left the pagan gods, you started to worship this Jewish carpenter who supposedly rose from the dead, and so the gods are angry, and look what you've done to us, and we're going to take it out on your hides. And so this was a uncertain time. Paul also recognizes there is a place for singleness, but he regards it as a calling and a unique gift. Now, how do I know that? He recognizes each person has his gift. Charisma is actually the Greek word that this comes from God. One is single, another is married. Singleness in some societies, Bruce Winter points out in his commentary on 1 Corinthians, was subject to cruel innuendo. At other times, the church overvalued or undervalued, in each case contrary to God's word. Like other gifts, it is personal, one individual from God. Now, the point that Bruce Winters is making is that Paul regards marriage as one gift and singleness as another gift, both gifts that God determines. Okay, so Peter did not have the gift of celibacy. There are reasons to believe that Paul was married. We can weigh the evidence ourselves, but there are reasons to believe that Paul was married, including his place in the Sanhedrin. Remember that in Judaism, marriage was highly regarded for the continuing of the Jewish people, the passing on of things. And so a rabbi was expected to be a good family man. In fact, the qualifications for an elder are probably similar to some of the expectations that you would have of a leader, okay, in general. Now, why healing? What's this big thing about healing? We've had healing miracles, right? Um, what's the big issue? Okay, you have to remember the place that death had. Now, modern rabbis struggle with the doctrine of the fall of man. So when you look over the scholars, they really don't want to deal with it. And they don't deal with it the way we do. That was a previous program. But on some level, you have to understand that those reading the Genesis account could glean from that disease and death entered the world through sin. The rabbis later move away from the view of the idea of any sort of original sin. In fact, Rabbi Singer would hate that idea with a purple passion. But there is talk of Judaism into a Yasser Ra and a Yasser Ra and a Yasser Chai. Here's the problem. Once you admit human beings are fundamentally flawed from the beginning, then you have to have a remedy to sin. If you look at the Targunim on Genesis chapter 3, it talks about the fact, okay, that indeed the serpent represents, and the remedy the rabbis give for the fall or the curse is Torah study, admitting that there's a curse that occurs in Genesis chapter 3. And something happened there related to or very much like the fall. So again, there's a range of opinions, but part of the rabbi's opinions start to get molded by polemic against the teachings related to Messiah. So, the idea of looking forward to the restoration of God's rule on earth did not find this doctrine. I mean, those who were looking forward to it, if a Jewish person was really looking forward to the renewal of God's kingdom on earth, they wouldn't have found this doctrine so extraordinary. Now, here's what you need to understand. Jesus' control over disease demonstrates that he can bring the rule of God on earth, and thus he's the rightful Messiah. You understand? And so that's what's important here is Jesus continues to demonstrate that he can undo the fall. He can bring the rule of God, the restoration of God's goodness and rule on earth. He what was damaged by the fall, he has the authority and power to renew. And when you look at the verses in Isaiah related to the kingdom, understand that the kingdom undoes the fall. Not completely, but the idea is what got wrecked in the fall through Satan is restored in the kingdom and then permanently and more perfectly restored through a new heavens and new earth. So this becomes important. Now, the funny thing is the usage of Isaiah 53 in the quote. First of all, you need to understand something. Matthew is not quoting from the Masoretic text or the Septuagint. So he kind of does his own sort of quotation of the verse. Now, this verse is used by a lot of groups in terms of healing and deliverance ministries. Now, I'm going to be careful here. I do believe God heals. I do believe that he uses doctors. I believe that he's perfectly capable of doing that without doctors. He graciously uses doctors, which, by the way, allows them as image bearers some sort of role in restoring people and demonstrating his goodness. That doesn't mean doctors are saved. It means he displays himself through the medical arts in allowing people to indeed know what they know. Because if they didn't know what they knew, we would have bigger problems. So he allows us as image bearers to do roles that benefit society and other people. And he allows this even to unsaved people, which is really cool. Okay, we still get to be image bearers. We still get to do things that display him, sometimes when we don't even have a covenant relationship with him. Okay, but they would argue that healing physically is inherent in the atonement. In other words, God is obligated to heal people. Okay, it's not a choice that God has. Jesus' death guarantees that people get healed unless they don't have enough faith. And then it's on them. It's all their fault. If you're sick and you don't get healed, it's your fault because you didn't have enough faith. That's what they would argue. I want to take this apart just a little bit here. I don't think that's the point here. Okay, now there are several reasons why. First of all, we're not just dealing with physical healing. When you look at the passage in 16, evening had come, and they brought to him many who were demon possessed. Well, that's a little different than a head cold. Two, while it may include Jesus' ability to heal and to demonstrate his king stuff, atonement, as far as what's being considered here, is not being guaranteed, and it might be fulfilled, not that it has to be continually fulfilled. So there are textual clues to me that this may not be the carte blanche that people want it to be. And by the way, it's Jesus that does the healing. Now, the apostles will do some of that too. But there's nothing in the passage that says every believer necessarily can do this the exact same way Jesus did. Now, the argument is we have Jesus' authority. Yeah, but Jesus still gets to decide how that authority is used. So I'm not arguing against healing. I'm just saying it may not be as easy to make the jump as they would like it to be. That atonement doesn't necessarily guarantee every physical healing every time, all the time. By the way, it'd be terribly hard to necessarily get to heaven through disease if healing was somehow guaranteed. So I'm not going to take forever on this, but what I want to say is that the connection that they're making here between Jesus demonstrating his kingdom and the guarantee of physical healing is not necessarily a simple guaranteed thing the way they would say it's guaranteed. Okay, they're making more of this. The authorial intent here is that Jesus is fulfilling prophecy by demonstrating kingdom authority to verify his office as the Messiah. That's what's really going on here. All right. What does Jesus demonstrate through this? Okay. He's demonstrating more than physical healing. He's demonstrating power over the spiritual realm. This is going to get demonstrated again. And this is terribly important. Um, I'm going to pull out this book again, which I have a copy of now for my very own library. I'll kind of hold this up and see if it shows up. Okay. Um, this is again the theodicy of love. Now, it doesn't deal with healing. Okay. But what it does deal with is this idea related to how God wins. And one of the things that it points out um, is that there's this idea that God doesn't just overwhelmingly force the issue of forcing his good. He demonstrates his rule, he demonstrates his goodness, and he gets into an idea that Michael Heisner has, which is this idea that the angels form sort of a court, God being the king, and you have the heavenly council. And so Jesus is demonstrating authority that only God can have. And so, why does this become important? Muhammad never healed anybody. There's no recorded miracle healings by Muhammad. There's no recorded demon passing out stuff. See, if he's going to be a prophet and demonstrate his office so that his revelation is trusted, then usually the prophetic office is demonstrated through signs. In other words, signs basically function to verify the messenger was speaking under the authority of God and giving revelation. Now, we're not talking about what socks to wear. We're talking about giving new scripture. And so to verify that one was giving new scripture legitimately from God, of course, it had to match previous revelation, but also you would have the seal of God's divine sending and your office in terms of some sort of demonstration of God's authority in relationship to the fall and his restoration. Now, how do I get things like this? Well, I'm going to quickly turn to Hebrews 2:3. This isn't in your outline. This is extra stuff. Okay? How shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? Now, notice the order here, which was first began to be spoken by the Lord. That would be Jesus. Okay? And was confirmed by those who heard him. Okay, now who are them? Okay, now we're starting to talk about the apostles. God also bearing witness with signs and wonders and various miracles and gifts of the Spirit according to his own will. And so what Hebrews is saying is, look, there's a chain of verification going on here. And so basically, Jesus is demonstrating his power. How do you know I'm the king? I have kingdom authority over evil, and I have kingdom authority over those fallen angels who act as agents of evil. And so I am the one. I am the king. And so I'm going to demonstrate my kingly authority. So over the effects of the fall, as far as natural evil and disease, over the effects of the fall, as far as spiritual evil, Jesus is demonstrating. Now, Matthew does something very interesting. He begins to add in here the requirement. What is the response to Jesus' teaching? Jesus has demonstrated his teaching, his authority as far as his teaching, and he's demonstrated his authority as far as miracles. Now a response is needed. When I'm done with this, I'm going to look back in the Q&A because it sounds like there's some interesting sort of conversations here. But Jesus is going to basically broach this question with two individuals coming to him. Jesus saw the great multitude. Now, what Jesus always wanted to do was separate the followers from the fans. Did you catch that? Because that's like a neat refrigerator magnet. Okay, there's the followers and the fans. And he's always separating. In fact, Jesus did what megachurches would never like. Okay, you want to build a megachurch, you get everyone in. Okay, Jesus makes it hard for people. He's constantly sending people away. Not because he doesn't love people, but what he wants is a firm, full commitment. He doesn't want fans, he wants followers. And so he's always whittling people down. This is like anti-church growth here. Okay, you don't whittle people down. I think Jesus was more worried about quality than quantity. And by the way, the modern church can learn something from that. Okay, there's a place for trying to keep the quality up a little bit. When Jesus saw the great multitudes about him, he gave a command to depart to the other side. Okay, he's being pressed in. A certain scribe came and said to him, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Wow, that's magnificent. What an incredible commitment. And you look at the verse, and Jesus says, "Great, let's do it." Um, and that's not what he says. He makes it hard for the guy. Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. I'm not promising you accommodations if you come with me. I'm not saying I won't take care of you, but I'm not promising you a Hotel 6. Okay? It's going to be a roaming style. You're going to follow me wherever I go, when I go, and you're going to sleep where you need to sleep, and you're going to go and do what you're going to do. There's a certain pastor, and I've got somebody who just hangs on every word, and he's probably a great godly man, but you know, he keeps talking about radical commitment. And I always worry when radical commitment costs nothing radical. Okay? Radical this and radical that. And I have some friends that have gone to Papua New Guinea. One of the gentlemen, young ladies, I actually had them in Sunday school. Actually, he left his family business and went and dropped everything to do pioneer missions in Papua New Guinea. They'll probably never see this broadcast, but a shout out to Paul and Ellen Swenson, who are now with New Tribes. That's radical. Okay? They don't have a whole lot to come back to. They'd have to rebuild it. They burned their bridges and they went. That's really radical. I'm all for short term missions, but we just have to be careful of calling radical things not radical. These things can be the first steps, and they can be God's working, and they can make for people who are much more informed, and then some who are actually called to go and do. But we just have to be careful. When someone makes radical claims, I ask, well, what's it costing you to make the claim? Because if it costs very little, but the claim is very large, that's not radical. But it's good PR. Okay? Let's talk about another disciple who comes, and he basically talks about talks about burying his father. Now, the first one, he was overly enthusiastic. Okay, I mean, he starts, "I'm all in," and then Jesus says, "Well, are you really?" Um, And really, he's making a promise, I will follow you. And I just stuck that up, okay, because it's a future active indicative, but it functions in such a way that he's making a promise, okay? And so Jesus's point is discipleship is a complete commitment that may require the release of comfort and security. Okay. In fact, there's a story I'll tell you, but we'll get to the other one. Okay. This guy's overcautious. He starts out good, but he says, "Let me go and bury my father and follow you." And Jesus says, "Follow me and let the dead bury their dead." Now that sounds really insensitive, doesn't it? That sounds really insensitive. It's really not. There are several possibilities to text. By the way, a Jewish objection to this would be Jesus is calling for not meeting one's family obligations. This is irresponsible. Okay, it's not irresponsible. Jesus has reasons for that. Okay, this is a shallow commitment too. This one's overcautious. I'll go, but ooh, not yet. I heard a quote by Augustine. I want to see if it's true. He said, "Give me chastity and give me constancy, but don't give it to me yet." Uh, Kind of an interesting quote. This guy's kind of like the other guy was, "I'm all in," but it was all enthusiasm and emotion. This guy's like, "I want to come, but I'm really nervous about this, and I'm going to be overcautious." There's got to be a better time. We don't have a reason to believe this guy's father was dead. Well, why do you say that? Well, Tobit urged his son Tobias to be sure to bury him. "Son, when I'm dead, bury me." That's Tobit 4:3. The probability is that the disciple means that after his father is dead and buried, he will be free to follow Jesus. Okay? At the present day, an Oriental with his father sitting by his side has been known to say, respecting future projects, "But I must bury my father first." That's Palmer making comment on that. Jesus wanted first things first, even if his father was not actually dead. Service to Christ comes first. Now, the point that A.T. Robinson's making is that this is more of an excuse. This doesn't seem to be a good time. Let me take care of business until my father dies, and then I'll come follow you. And Jesus is saying, no, no, no. Not at your convenience do you follow me. You follow me at my convenience and my pleasure, not yours. So that's the second kind of shallow commitment. The next pericope begins to deal with his power over nature. Now, we saw his power over natural evil, but what about just natural law, the way things normally work? The minute he gets done with this, okay, and he calls for this discipleship, he got into a boat and his disciples followed him. By the way, they've been this ragtag crew just doing this. Some of them left their family businesses. One of them left a government job with Rome. And the disciples follow him, and suddenly a great tempest forms, rose from the sea, so that the boat was covered with waves, and he was asleep. And the disciples came to him and woke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we are perishing." By the way, you're going to learn about a very important word that we use right around Palm Sunday and where it comes from. And he said to them, "Why are you fearful, O you of little faith?" And then he arose, rebuked the winds and sea, and there was great calm. And so the men marveled, saying, "Who is this, that even the winds and waves obey him?" Now let's check out what's going here. First of all, they're absolutely terrified. Now these are fishermen, okay? James and John are rough and tumble, okay? They're just intense. They're backwoodsy, and they're no individuals who have never been out on the sea. There's some comments here, guys. I'm excited. The Council of Jamina is being commented on. I'm going to have to jump back in here because there's some textual questions that are coming up, but they aren't germane to Matthew at the moment. So let's hold some of those thoughts, and I'm going to want to jump in here because there's a discussion of Hebrew texts and whether we have a complete Bible and what we have for canon. And as far as Old Testament canon, yes, I think it is fixed, particularly the Hebrew. And then I think there are canonicity issues involved with the New Testament. And there are reasons to outwardly reject the Apocrypha. So Matthew is not a contested book. So I'm going to continue with this for now, but I'm going to see back at this conversation here. What you do need to understand is that the Sea of Galilee is about 680 feet below the Mediterranean, and these squalls would come down from the summit of Mount Hermon. Now, I've been there, and they come with tremendous voice. In fact, it was like an earthquake. It's the word we get seismology from, and then the word we get whirlwind from in the Greek. And so these are big storms. Jesus is literally asleep. By the way, it was sleeping. It's in the imperfect. He wasn't just asleep. He was just sleeping away. And they say, "Save us, Lord. We are perishing." Normal word for save, but the phrase "save us, Lord" is an interesting phrase because it's a word we get Hosanna from. Okay, Yasha is to save. This is in the causative. And so the na, Hoshana, is the way you'd say it in Hebrew. The na is called the particle of entreaty, and it's like a nice way of giving something that's a command. So something's in the command form, but you're talking to a superior. Well, you can't command a superior. You don't, flaunt or get out of line here. You don't speak to one who is greater in authority or equal in authority that way. It would be rude. And so there's something called the particle of entreaty where you're entreating somebody, but it's almost like you're entreating them. It's almost like a command, but you're entreating them. So you have that sort of thing there, and that particle of entreaty is used by Abraham, and it's used throughout the New Testament. So you have Hoshana or Hosanna because the SH becomes an S sound. And so the disciples are certain that they are in the process of being killed. We are all going to die. Jesus doesn't question their faith because there isn't a storm there. I mean, there's a real storm. Jesus questions their faith because of who they're with and the fact they should have trusted in his goodness and character, and Jesus is on a divine mission for the Father. If they were with him and were his, then God's power protects them. They're on the same mission, and they're with God's anointed, so they share in that covering and that protection, and they should have trusted Jesus knew what he was doing, and they should have trusted that Jesus's Father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, would protect them because Jesus was on the Father's mission. They start to catch the message. Why is all this going on? So that Jesus could demonstrate his authority over nature. Who can control the created order except the Creator? So they start to get it. Jesus demonstrates his authority and expects his people to give them his allegiance. That is the conclusion. Now, there's a lot of talk about textual stuff here. First of all, for a book to be biblical, it has to agree with the character and revelation of that which precedes it. There are things in the Apocrypha that are in direct opposition to established biblical doctrine. And so, if you have Jesus being portrayed as a little child who wantonly kills things and creates things only so he can smash them and enjoy that, as the Gospel of Thomas seems to do, then you have good reasons for rejecting it. So, no future revelation ever is contrary to the character of previous revelation. Second of all, Jesus is very clear that you've killed all the prophets. Check out Matthew 26. From Abel to Zechariah, son of Berechiah. The Jewish order of scriptures is Genesis, and it ends in Second Chronicles. The law, the prophets, and the writings. The last prophet who dies as a martyr is in Second Chronicles. Zechariah, son of Berechiah. The first martyr is in Genesis. It's Abel, who's killed by Cain while he's being righteous. Therefore, Jesus says you've killed every prophet from the beginning, Genesis, to the end, Second Chronicles. He establishes the Jewish chronicle. So you want to be very careful about this. No, the 66 books aren't a sacred cow. They're what God intended in his canon. When we say canon, we mean the rule. Now, are the other books useful? Yes. They are very useful in establishing what Jewish thought was like, and so what Jesus is saying to his audience as far as background. But this higher criticism stuff that often goes on with guys sometimes like Bart Ehrman or others who want to say that there are books that have been deliberately kept out of our Bible, well, that's worthy of a Hanks movie. Okay, that's worthy of a Dan Brown novel. We can find value in those books without their being inspired, but we need to differentiate between the canon and the non-canon. So the idea that there may be books hanging around and the church somehow suppressed them is something that Hollywood best address. So you want to be careful. Now, I'm not saying I'm mad at anybody in the chat. I'm glad you're all here. But you want to be real careful here, because what you use as the canon is going to determine where you get your doctrines. So that's really kind of scary. And so I'm not trying to rain on anyone's parade. I'm saying, ooh, we could come up with some really scary doctrines, and I don't want that. I mean, doctrines that would fall outside of, the parameters, okay? So you want to be a little careful. I don't believe in purgatory, so I'm, tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm just a little scared about some of the doctrines that come out of that. So that's where we're at. But so let's glean what we can. Let's understand Second Temple Jewish era thought. By the way, I turn to those books a lot to understand some of the real background of the New Testament, because I don't read my New Testament